The temple halls were vast and cold, their vaulted arches echoing with silence. Etched into the walls were names, thousands of them, etched in alien script, each one representing a life lost in the wars that had burned across the galaxy. A single figure sat on the polished stone bench, her hands clutching a candle that trembled with every quiet breath she took. She was dressed in mourning black, but her sapphire blue skin stood out against the shadows, her silver hair falling loose over her shoulders. Her eyes, wide and glistening, scanned the empty space, waiting for someone, anyone, to come. Her name was Lyra, and she was now a widow. The thought felt impossible, unreal, even as she whispered it to herself. Her husband, Chiron, had been a decorated captain of their people, admired for his courage and devotion to his crew. He had survived countless battles against ruthless enemies, and yet, in a cruel twist, he had fallen on what was meant to be his last mission before retiring. They had promised each other peace once it was over. Instead, all she had was a folded flag and his name carved on cold stone. The candles scattered throughout the hall flickered gently, some half melted from previous memorials. Lyra set hers down beneath Chiron's engraved name. The small flame reflected in her wet eyes, a fragile symbol of remembrance. But the chamber was silent, and it dawned on her that no one else was coming. The soldiers who had served under him, the commanders who had praised him, the comrades who had sworn oaths, they were all absent. The war had left so many jaded, too tired, too broken to attend yet another funeral. Lyra wrapped her arms around herself, shivering despite the warmth of the candle. She felt the crushing weight of abandonment settle in. Had Charon's life meant so little to them all? Was his sacrifice just another name on the wall, forgotten already by those who should have stood beside her? She bowed her head and her shoulders shook with grief. Footsteps echoed down the corridor. She froze, daring not to hope. They were heavy, purposeful, carrying the weight of armor. Her eyes darted toward the entrance, and in the dim glow of the temple lights a figure appeared, broad shoulders clad in worn combat plating, a helmet tucked under one arm and scars etched across his weathered face. A human. His presence was startling, rare in this sacred alien hall, but unmistakable. Lyra blinked rapidly, her tears momentarily paused by confusion. The human approached with a quiet solemnity, his eyes locked on the wall of names until they found the one he sought. He walked past the empty benches, past the unlit candles, and came to stand beside her. His movements were careful, deliberate, as though each step was guided by memory and reverence. He knelt before Chiron's name, lowering his head, and gently placed a small, battered medallion on the ground. It was scratched, scorched from fire and worn thin with age, but its meaning radiated through the gesture. Then he lit his own candle and set it beside hers. Only then did he turn to her, his voice quiet, rough with emotion. "I'm sorry I'm late." The words were simple, but they hit her like a wave. She stared at him, at the sorrow etched into his human features, and realized this was no stranger. She had heard of him, Nathan Cole, the human who had fought beside Charon in countless battles, the one her husband had once described not just as a comrade, but as a brother forged in fire, and here he was standing at her side when no one else had come. Her throat tightened and she whispered, You knew him?" Nathan nodded, his jaw tense. "I didn't just know him. He saved my life more times than I can count. And I swore I'd never let him be forgotten." His voice cracked on the last word, betraying a grief he could no longer hold back. Lyra felt her tears rise again, but this time they weren't from loneliness. She wasn't alone anymore. Someone else carried Charon's memory. Someone else bore the weight of his legacy. She wiped at her cheeks, trembling as the human's presence sank into her heart like an anchor in a storm. Nathan glanced at her candle, then back at hers, and quietly asked, "Did he ever tell you about the promise we made?" She shook her head, confusion flickering across her face. Nathan exhaled slowly, his gaze fixed on Chiron's engraved name. "On one of our worst deployments, when everything went to hell, we promised each other that if one of us fell, the other would stand for him. No matter where, no matter when, no matter the cost. I couldn't stop him from falling, but I can keep that promise now." Her breath caught and her heart squeezed with a painful warmth. She looked at Nathan, truly looked, and saw that he was just as broken as she was. His scars weren't only on his skin but buried deep in his eyes. The silence between them stretched, filled only by the faint crackle of candle flames. Outside the temple, the distant hum of the city seemed a world away. Here, in this hollow sanctuary, there were only two souls bound by grief for the same man. Lyra spoke softly, her voice trembling. "I thought no one would come." Nathan turned to her, his expression fierce but kind. "Then you don't know your husband as well as I did. He saved lives across half the galaxy, and even if the rest of the universe forgets him, I never will." Her lips parted and a quiet sob broke free, but this time it was carried by relief, not despair. She covered her face with her hands, shoulders shaking. Nathan placed a steady hand on her arm, grounding her not with words but with presence. Lyra lowered her hands, meeting his gaze. "Thank you," she whispered. It felt inadequate, but it was all she could manage. Nathan gave a small nod. "He deserves more than an empty hall." He stood, pulling in a sharp breath, and raised his candle. The flame flickered brightly, reflecting in the engraved letters of Chiron's name. "And I intend to give it to him." The weight in Lyra's chest shifted. For the first time since she had received the news of Chiron's death, she felt that his memory wouldn't simply vanish into the void. That someone else, someone who had bled beside him, would make sure of it. Her voice steadied. "Then I'll stand with you." Nathan's eyes softened and a small, tired smile tugged at his lips. Together they bowed their heads before the wall of names, two candles burning side by side in the shadows. And though grief still clung to their hearts, something new sparked in the silence, a fragile bond of remembrance that neither time nor death could erase. The days after the memorial blurred into a haze of silence for Lyra. She stayed in her quarters, staring at the folded flag on the table, the smell of extinguished candles still clinging to her hair. Grief was not new to her people, but this was personal, a wound carved too deep. She expected Nathan to leave after the ceremony, to vanish back into whatever life he had outside the war. Yet each day she found herself wondering if he was still on the station. A strange comfort took root in the thought that perhaps she was not entirely abandoned. On the third day, her question was answered. There was a knock at her door, heavy but cautious, and when it slid open, Nathan stood there with his helmet under his arm. His armor looked more battered than ever, and his eyes carried the same exhaustion she felt inside. He didn't say much, just offered a small packet of food, the kind soldiers ate on long campaigns. It wasn't what she needed, but it was something, and in that gesture she saw the same loyalty her husband had once spoken of with admiration. She hesitated, then let him inside. The quarters felt emptier than ever with someone else there, but not unwelcome. Nathan didn't crowd her with words or hollow comforts. Instead, he sat at her table, setting the medallion he had placed at the memorial between them. Its worn surface caught the light, etched with marks she didn't recognize. She found herself asking about them, and for the first time in days, she listened. Nathan explained each scar on the medallion, each one representing a battle, each one marking a memory he and Karen had carved together. He spoke in halting words, his voice weighted with remembrance, but there was warmth beneath the sorrow. Lyra found herself clinging to the stories as if by hearing them, she could keep a part of her husband alive. Every laugh, every reckless moment, every scar carved into the medallion became a fragment of Chiron she had never known. The hours passed quietly, the stories fading into silence. Lyra realized her tears weren't falling as heavily as before. Nathan had given her something she didn't expect, not sympathy but presence. She could see now why Karen had spoken of him as a brother. He carried himself not as a guest but as family, someone bound to their lives by more than blood or species. When Nathan finally stood to leave, she stopped him. Her hand trembled as it touched his arm, her voice barely above a whisper. "Stay, at least for tonight." The loneliness had become unbearable, and she didn't want to face the dark with only silence for company. Nathan studied her for a moment, then gave a small nod, placing his helmet gently on the floor. That night, he didn't intrude on her grief. He simply sat in the chair near the window, keeping vigil as she drifted into restless sleep. When she woke, the candle she had lit for Karen had burned low, and Nathan was still there, eyes heavy but watchful, like a sentinel. For the first time since Karen's death, she didn't wake to an empty room. The following days formed a quiet rhythm. Nathan returned often, bringing simple offerings, a new candle, food she didn't eat, a small token from the battlefield. He asked nothing of her, and yet his presence filled the hollow spaces her people had left behind. Whispers began to stir on the station, though. A human soldier lingering around an alien widow was not common, and eyes followed them whenever they walked the halls together. But Lyra found she didn't care. One evening, she asked the question that had haunted her since the memorial. Why did no one else come? Her voice cracked under the weight of it. Nathan didn't answer right away. He sat quietly, his jaw tense, before speaking. War takes more than lives. It takes memory. People lose too much, so they learn not to remember. It's the only way they can keep going. His eyes hardened. But I refused to let him be just another name on the wall. His words sank into her chest like a blade. She wanted to argue, to believe her people would honor Karen, but she couldn't. The empty benches at the memorial had already told her the truth. Nathan's resolve, though, gave her strength she didn't know she needed. He wasn't just standing for Karen, he was standing for her, too. In the quiet of her quarters, she found herself asking him more questions. About Earth, about the battles they had fought, about what Karen had meant to him. Nathan answered each one with patience, though sometimes his voice faltered with the strain of old wounds. She began to notice the way his hands clenched when he spoke of certain campaigns, the shadows that passed across his eyes when recalling fallen comrades. His grief was just as heavy as hers, only carried differently. The bond between them grew in those long conversations. It wasn't built on romance or pity, but something deeper. Shared pain, shared remembrance, and the stubborn refusal to let Karen be erased. Nathan was no longer just her husband's human comrade. He had become part of her mourning, part of her survival. One night, as they lit 2 new candles together at the memorial wall, Lyra finally allowed herself to speak the words she had avoided. I don't know how to go on without him. Her voice cracked, and she felt the weight of her admission press down. Nathan's hand tightened gently on her shoulder. You don't have to go on alone. The simplicity of it broke her, and tears fell freely as she leaned against him. He didn't recoil or try to comfort her with meaningless phrases. He stood firm, steady, letting her grief pour out until the flame of the candle blurred through her tears. In his silence, she found strength. The whispers on the station grew louder, suspicion curling in the air. Some claimed the human was exploiting her grief. Others accused her of dishonoring tradition. The looks she received burned with judgment, but Nathan never flinched. He walked beside her as if the stares meant nothing, as if her pain mattered more than the gossip of the crowd. Lyra realized something then. Karen had chosen Nathan as his brother-in-arms for a reason, and now, even in death, Karen had given her someone who could stand with her when her own people could not. She began to see Nathan not just as her husband's comrade, but as an anchor against the tide of loneliness. One evening, when they sat together in silence, Lyra broke it with a fragile truth. You've kept your promise to him, but you've also kept me alive. Nathan looked at her, startled, his eyes softening. He didn't answer right away, only gave a faint nod, as though the words carried more weight than he could bear to acknowledge aloud. That night, as she extinguished the candle, she felt a new ember of determination burning in her chest. Perhaps she would never stop grieving, but she could learn to carry Kyron's memory differently, with Nathan's presence beside her, with their candles lit side by side, and with the knowledge that her husband's legacy had not been abandoned. The memorial hall no longer felt empty when she entered it now. 2 candles always burned there, one hers and one Nathan's, their light steady against the shadows, and for the first time, Lyra began to believe that her husband's name would not fade into silence. Nathan had given her something her people could not: remembrance without forgetting, grief without isolation, and as the days turned to weeks, she began to feel the first fragile threads of healing weaving through the cracks in her heart. The weeks bled into months, and though grief lingered like an old wound, Lyra noticed the world around her shifting. People who had once ignored her began to notice Nathan's constant presence. Soldiers on leave eyed him warily, their voices lowered when he passed. Rumors swirled across the station, of a human soldier haunting the widow of an alien captain, of promises made and debts unpaid. But when Lyra heard the whispers, she found she no longer cared. What mattered was that Nathan still lit a candle for Chiron every night. Nathan never spoke of leaving, but she wondered often if he would. He had no ties to her world, no duty binding him here. Yet every evening he returned, bringing his quiet presence into her life. Sometimes he spoke of Earth, of skies filled with endless blue and fields stretching wider than sight. His descriptions were raw and imperfect, yet they painted images in her mind of a world Chiron had once dreamed of seeing. Those stories comforted her more than she admitted. One evening, as they walked back from the memorial hall, a group of young officers intercepted them. Their uniforms bore the sharp insignias of command, their faces set in lines of disdain. One of them, tall and severe, sneered as his gaze fixed on Nathan. "Strange company for the widow of a captain," he remarked. "You dishonor his memory walking beside an outsider." The words cut through the air like a blade. Lyra's chest tightened, but before she could reply, Nathan stepped forward. His voice was calm but firm. "I fought with him. I bled beside him. Where were you when he held the line?" The officer faltered, caught off guard by the human's steady glare. For a moment silence stretched, and then the officers muttered amongst themselves before retreating. Nathan turned back to her, his jaw tight, but his eyes softened when he saw her shaken expression. "They don't matter," he said simply. His words lingered in her mind that night. For so long, she had bent beneath the weight of others' judgment, their cold absence at the funeral, their sharp whispers in the halls. But Nathan had shown her that loyalty was not measured by bloodlines or shared species. It was measured by action, by standing when others would not. Her husband had known this truth, and now she finally understood it as well. Still, doubts gnawed at her. One night she asked Nathan why he stayed. His answer was quiet but unwavering. "Because he would have done the same for me, and because you shouldn't bear this alone." The simplicity of it stole her words. She realized then that his loyalty wasn't bound by obligation. It was bound by choice. That choice humbled her. The station grew restless in the months that followed. Political tensions rose and whispers of war stirred again. Soldiers passed through the halls with grim faces, their eyes fixed on distant fronts. In the midst of it, the memorial candles burned steadily, two flames against the dark. Nathan's presence became almost symbolic, an image of defiance, of memory preserved. Lyra heard even strangers mention it, their voices laced with reluctant respect. One evening, when the hall was empty, Lyra watched Nathan place his candle with unusual care. His hand lingered over the flame, and when he spoke, his voice was low. "I sometimes wonder if I'll ever stop fighting." The confession startled her. She had always seen him as unwavering, unshakable. Now she glimpsed the weariness beneath his armor, the endless battle scars he carried. She reached out, laying her hand over his. "You don't have to fight alone anymore," she said softly. The words weren't meant to be profound, but they made his shoulders ease just slightly. For a moment she thought she saw the faintest smile ghost across his lips before it vanished into solemnity again. The bond between them grew stronger, though neither spoke it aloud. It wasn't love. Not yet, not in the way stories described it. It was something more fragile, born of shared silence, mutual grief, and unwavering loyalty. And it scared her, because it meant she was learning to breathe again. She hadn't thought that possible. The judgment of others didn't fade. A message arrived one day from one of Chiron's distant cousins, condemning her for spending so much time with the human. The words dripped with venom, betrayal, dishonor, shame. Lyra trembled as she read it, but when she showed it to Nathan, he simply burned the message in the flame of his candle. "Let the fire have it," he said, and she felt the chains of guilt loosen. One night, after placing their candles, Nathan surprised her. He pulled a small device from his belt and activated it, projecting a grainy hologram. It was of Chiron and Nathan together, younger, laughing in the midst of a battlefield camp. The sound of her husband's laughter filled the hall raw and alive, and it brought her to her knees. Nathan stood silently watching her, his own eyes wet with memory. "I thought you should have this," he whispered. Lyra clutched the device as though it were her husband himself. The image faded, but its echo lingered in her heart. She looked up at Nathan, her vision blurred with tears. "Thank you," she whispered. But the words felt too small, too shallow, for what he had just given her. He had given her back a piece of Chiron. The bond between them grew into something undeniable. She began to notice how her steps no longer dragged as heavily, how the silence of her quarters wasn't as suffocating when she knew he would arrive. Sometimes she caught him watching her with an expression she couldn't name, something between sorrow and fierce determination. She wondered if he saw the same in her. Whispers reached her of other widows who began lighting candles again, inspired by the sight of her and Nathan's ritual. What had started as 2 flames became 4, then 8, and soon the hall no longer stood in silence. Others began to return, remembering the names they had tried to bury. Lyra realized Nathan had sparked something larger than either of them, an unwillingness to forget. The station's leaders noticed as well. One commander approached her privately, warning her to distance herself from the human before it stirred more unrest. She met his gaze firmly and said, "He is more faithful than any of you were when my husband was laid to rest." The commander recoiled, unable to argue. Lyra felt a fire rise in her chest she hadn't known she still carried. Nathan, however, seemed unaware of his growing influence. To him, each candle was simply a promise kept, each evening ritual a debt repaid. Lyra watched him and her admiration deepened. He had no need for recognition, no hunger for honor. His loyalty was pure, unwavering, and it reshaped the way she saw not just him but herself. One night, she dared to voice the question that had lived in her heart. "Do you ever regret it? Carrying all this weight?" Nathan looked at her for a long moment before answering. "Every day, but regret doesn't mean I'll stop. He was my brother, and you're his legacy." His voice softened on the last word, and it struck her like a chord. She was more than a widow in his eyes. She was someone worth standing beside. Her heart ached with conflicting emotions. She still loved Chiron, would always love him, but she could no longer deny the warmth Nathan brought into her life. It wasn't replacing her husband, it was survival. A new way forward forged in grief. For the first time, she allowed herself to imagine a future that didn't feel like an endless shadow. The Hall of Remembrance grew brighter each night as more candles filled the benches. Lyra walked among them with Nathan at her side, and though grief still pressed on her heart, she felt something else growing too. Hope. Fragile, flickering like the flames, but alive nonetheless. Nathan's presence had become more than comfort. It had become a lifeline, and as she looked at him in the glow of dozens of flames, she realized her story was no longer about loss alone. It was about remembrance, loyalty, and the fragile beginnings of something new. The Hall of Remembrance glowed brighter than it had in years. Where once only 2 candles flickered, now dozens lined the benches, each one a flame of defiance against forgetting. Lyra walked slowly among them, her steps steady, Nathan close beside her. The whispers that had once condemned her had grown quieter, replaced by murmurs of reluctant admiration. What began as her grief and Nathan's loyalty had become a movement. But with that movement came resistance. Officials summoned her one evening, their faces drawn with disapproval. They spoke of tradition, of order, of the risk of unrest. They told her Nathan's presence undermined unity, that humans were outsiders, that the station couldn't be seen honoring one man above the thousands who had fallen. Their words struck her as cold, empty of the weight she carried in her chest every day. She left without answering them, her silence more cutting than any argument. When she told Nathan, he only shrugged. "I didn't come here for them," he said simply. His voice held no bitterness, only truth. That night, as they lit their candles, Lyra found herself gripping his hand briefly. It was an unspoken vow that no matter what others said, neither of them would abandon this ritual. Together, they stood against the silence of forgetting. As weeks passed, the bond between them deepened into something undeniable. They spoke more openly, sometimes even laughing softly at old stories Nathan recalled of Chiron. Lyra was startled the first time she laughed. It felt strange, fragile, as if her heart had forgotten how. Nathan looked at her then, eyes warm, and she realized he was helping her breathe again piece by piece. One evening, after the hall had emptied, Nathan lingered beside her. His voice was low, almost hesitant. "I sometimes wonder if he'd approve of me being here. With you." The words struck her, and for a moment she couldn't breathe. But then she reached for his hand, her grip steady. "He chose you as his brother. He would want you here, and so do I." Her answer brought a rare softness to his face, and in that silence something unspoken passed between them. The shift didn't go unnoticed. Some called it scandalous, others whispered of betrayal. But those who lit candles began to see something else. A widow and a human soldier carrying grief together, showing that memory could be shared across species, across worlds. What began as gossip turned slowly into quiet respect, then inspiration. Nathan's loyalty was undeniable, and Lyra's strength became a symbol. One night as they left the hall, they found a crowd gathered outside. Dozens of families, soldiers, and widows had come with candles in hand. They pressed them into Lyra's palms, asking her to place them at the wall. Nathan stepped aside, watching as she walked forward and lit each one, her hands trembling with the honor. By the end, the hall glowed brighter than it ever had. The wall of names seemed alive with light. Tears streamed down her face as she turned back to the crowd. For the first time, she didn't feel like a widow standing alone. She felt like a guardian of memory, and beside her, Nathan stood like a sentinel. Together, they had transformed grief into a flame no shadow could smother. Later that night, in the quiet of her quarters, she spoke words she had carried too long. "I thought I had lost everything, but you've given me something back. Not just his memory, but a future I didn't think was possible." Nathan didn't reply immediately. He looked at her with eyes that carried every battle, every scar, every promise. Then softly he said, "We'll carry it together." Her heart ached at those words, but this time it wasn't the ache of loss. It was something new, tender, and frightening. She realized then that her story wasn't ending with grief. It was beginning with resilience. Nathan wasn't replacing Chiron nor erasing him. He was helping her carry what remained, and together they were building something that honored the past while daring to step into tomorrow. Their bond grew unspoken, but undeniable. Some nights they sat in silence, watching the flames dance at the memorial. Other nights they spoke for hours, unraveling memories, hopes, and even fears. Lyra began to see the cracks in Nathan's armor, the humanity he rarely let others glimpse. He wasn't unbreakable. He was tired, scarred, and lonely, but in his loyalty, she saw beauty. One evening, she took his hand openly in the hall, no longer caring for the eyes upon them. Whispers erupted, but she walked with her head high, Nathan at her side. She realized that strength was not in silence but in defiance, in choosing what mattered even when the world disapproved. The flames behind them burned brighter than ever, a testament to memory, loyalty, and something greater than tradition. News spread across the station and beyond. Tales of the widow and the human soldier lighting candles for the forgotten reached other colonies, other memorials. Soon, halls across the galaxy began to glow again, each flame a spark of remembrance reignited. What began as a promise between two warriors had grown into a movement no council could smother. For Lyra, the change was deeply personal. Her quarters no longer felt like a tomb. The folded flag was no longer a symbol of silence but of legacy. She still wept at times, still felt the ache of loss, but now there was someone beside her to share the weight. Nathan had become more than Chiron's comrade. He had become her anchor, her companion, her proof that humans carried a strength no other species could match. One night, as they walked home from the hall, Lyra stopped under the glow of the station lights. Her voice trembled, but her eyes were steady. "I never thought I would feel this again." "Not after him." Nathan studied her silently, his breath heavy. Then with quiet conviction he said, "He'd want you to live, and so do I." The words wrapped around her heart like a shield. She realized then that love could grow even in the ashes of loss, not as a replacement but as a continuation, a way to honor what was gone while embracing what still remained. Nathan had given her that gift, and she knew she would never let it go. The Hall of Remembrance continued to blaze with light, a symbol carried far beyond their station. But for Lyra, the truest light burned in the quiet moments. 2 candles lit side by side, her hand resting in Nathan's, and the memory of Chiron alive between them. It was not the end of her grief, but it was the beginning of her healing. Nathan never stopped lighting a candle for his brother in arms, and Lyra never stopped lighting hers. Together they stood as keepers of a promise, as guardians of memory, and as proof that even across death and species, bonds of loyalty and love could endure. In the glow of the candles, she no longer felt alone. The widow who thought no one would come had found not only companionship but a future brighter than she could have imagined. And in the silence of the hall, where shadows once reigned, 2 flames always burned brighter than the rest, steadfast, unyielding, eternal.